For 50 years, Professor Dmitri Volkov dismissed every ghost story, every unexplained signal as mere atmospheric noise. But in his locked drawer sat a recording that defied everything he taught: the sound of someone breathing in the vacuum of space. When a derelict Soviet capsule appears on satellite imagery, tumbling through orbit like a cosmic tombstone, Dmitri realizes his ghost has a name, and she's been waiting half a century to tell her story. The air in the lecture hall was stale, thick with the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten facts. Before a scattered audience of 20-odd students, Professor Dmitri Volkov stood as a monument to order in a world of intellectual entropy. He was 71 years old, with eyes that had seen too much and a mind that had catalogued it all. His suit was perfectly pressed, a dark grey armour against the sloppiness of the modern age, marred only by a single frayed thread at his left cuff, a tiny rebellion of chaos he refused to acknowledge. Behind him, a diagram glowed on the projector screen, a complex web of lines and labels depicting the Earth's ionosphere. As you can see, Dmitri's voice was a dry rustle of paper, precise and devoid of passion. The F2 layer, under specific solar conditions, can act as a natural duct. A high-frequency radio wave, transmitted at the correct angle, becomes trapped. It propagates, bounces, reflects sometimes for thousands of kilometers, sometimes for minutes or even hours after the initial transmission. He pointed a laser at a looping arrow on the diagram. This creates what we call long-delay echoes. To the untrained ear, they can sound unusual, distorted, voices from nowhere, but they are merely physics, a predictable, if elegant, quirk of our planet's electromagnetic field. A young woman in the third row raised her hand. "Professor," she began, her voice laced with the eager curiosity he'd long since lost. "Some people say that these kinds of signals could explain, well, supernatural stuff. Like ghost sightings, or those weird UFO recordings." A flicker of something annoyance, bitterness, passed across Dmitri's face. Before being suppressed by decades of discipline, he clicked the laser pen off. The small red dot vanished. "An appealing fiction," he said, the words clipped. "It is human nature to seek patterns in chaos, to assign agency to the inanimate. We crave meaning, so we invent it. We imagine ghosts in the static, because the alternative, that the static is simply static, is unbearable to our narrative-driven minds." He looked out at the young faces, seeing not students, but a new generation of believers looking for a scientific excuse for their superstitions. "Let me be unequivocal," he stated, his voice dropping slightly, carrying the weight of an unchallengeable axiom. "There are no ghosts. There are no mysterious signals from worlds beyond our own. There is only physics, there is only data, and the data, upon rigorous inspection, is always, inevitably, boring. Every mystery has a rational explanation. The universe, I assure you, does not care enough about us to whisper." His office was his sanctuary, a fortress of quiet order against the noise of the world. Books stood in rigid formation on the shelves, alphabetized by author, then sorted by publication date. Papers were corralled into neat rectangular stacks on his desk. Here, in the regulated dark, Dmitri Volkov could almost believe in the world he described to his students, a world governed by knowable laws, where every variable could be isolated and every anomaly explained. Almost. From a locked drawer, he retrieved a key, and from a cabinet, he withdrew the source of his life's great cognitive dissonance. It was a Jupiter 202, a Soviet-era reel-to-reel tape machine, heavy, black, and built like a bunker. He placed it on his desk, the single object in the room that did not conform to the library-like tidiness. Its presence was a violation. He sat, the worn leather of his chair groaning a soft complaint, and threaded a brittle, aging tape onto the spindles. This was his ritual. His shame. He slid a pair of bulky, military-grade headphones over his ears, the padded cups swallowing the ambient silence of the room, isolating him completely. He did not touch the speaker volume. This was a communion for one. His finger, steady and sure from a lifetime of precision, pressed the play button. The soft hiss of magnetic tape filled his ears, a sound like falling rain on a distant sea. For a moment, there was nothing else. Then, it began. Faintly at first, then rising from the depths of the static came the sound. It wasn't a voice, not a word. It was a rhythm. A slow, cyclical, impossibly strained pattern of inhalation and exhalation. It was the sound of breathing, distorted by distance and desperation. A ragged metronome counting down the final seconds of a life. Underneath it, a faint electronic tone warbled, a weak, dying bird call. In the faint glow of the machine SVU meter, Dmitri's face transformed. The stern professor, the man of unwavering reason, dissolved. In his place was a haunted witness, his jaw tight, his eyes wide with a half-century of unresolved horror. He was 20 years old again, sitting in a listening post near the Caspian Sea, a young, brilliant signals analyst for the GRU. He was hearing it for the first time, this impossible sound from a silent sky, a sound his superiors would later order him to classify as anomalous ionospheric reflection. A lie. He knew it was a lie then, and he knew it now. For 50 years, this recording had been his ghost, his personal, unfalsifiable data point. This was the whisper the universe was not supposed to make. He was lost in the memory, adrift in the static of 1961, when a flash of blue light in the periphery of his vision broke the spell. A notification had popped up on his computer monitor, a small, intrusive rectangle of modernity invading his analog ritual. It was a news alert from a major aerospace journal, a publication he subscribed to out of professional habit. The headline was simple, direct, and world-shattering. Aurium-X satellite imagery locates unidentified Soviet-era space capsule in decaying orbit. Dmitri's breath caught in his chest. His eyes darted to the screen, reading the words again, and then to the image below them. It was grainy, a long-distance shot taken by a powerful orbital telescope, but it was unmistakable. A small, conical object, a classic Vostok-type descent module, was tumbling slowly through the infinite black. It was charred, battered, a piece of derelict history, and on its scorched hull, just visible in the enhanced image, was the faint, iconic red star of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. He tore the headphones from his head, letting them clatter onto the desk. The sound of strained breathing vanished, replaced by the frantic drumming of his own heart. He leaned forward, his face inches from the screen, his mind struggling to bridge the chasm that had just opened in his reality. The ghost on the tape, the object in the sky. For 50 years, the past had been a recording, a private torment trapped on a magnetic ribbon. Now, it was an object. It had mass. It had a trajectory. It was real, and it was falling. His phone rang, a shrill digital sound that felt like a sacrilege in the suddenly sacred space of his office. He stared at it, an unfamiliar number glowing on the screen. He hesitated, then answered, his hand trembling slightly. Professor Volkov. The voice was young, female, and radiated a confidence that felt alien to him now. It was sharp, clear, and cut through the fog of his shock. Yes, Dmitri managed, his own voice sounding foreign. My name is Zara Mikhailov. I'm the CEO of Aurium-X, of course, the company from the article. Our deep space network imaged the object 2 days ago, she continued, speaking with the brisk efficiency of someone who didn't waste time. Professor, official channels are already moving to dismiss it. Roscosmos is calling it a non-man-rated boilerplate from a failed test. The Pentagon is calling it a defunct Molniya satellite. They are coordinating their stories. They want it to be space junk. Dmitri was silent, his mind racing. I've read your work, Professor, Zara said, her tone shifting slightly. becoming more personal. Your 2008 paper on anomalous signal propagation during the early Cold War. Your analysis was meticulous. You argued that certain recorded events couldn't be fully explained by standard ionospheric ducting models. She was talking about the public version of his work. The heavily sanitized, purely academic theories he'd published, the work where he danced around the edges of the truth without ever naming it. That capsule has been up there for a very, very long time, Zara said, her voice dropping, drawing him in. It's not on any official launch manifest from any country. It does not officially exist, but you and I both know it does. I have the best orbital tracking technology in the world, Professor, but I don't have the context. I don't have the history. You do. A pause hung in the air, thick with unspoken possibilities. I believe, she said, her voice now a firm, unwavering statement of purpose, that you might be the only person alive who can help me prove what that object really is. Dmitri agreed to the meeting. To refuse would have been its own kind of madness, a willful blindness more profound than any superstition he'd ever condemned. He found himself the next day in a world he barely recognized, a space that felt more like science fiction than science fact. The headquarters of Aurium-X were a symphony of glass and brushed steel, a hyper-modern cathedral dedicated to the gods of progress and private enterprise. Everything was silent, seamless, and overwhelmingly new. It was the antithesis of his own life, of his cluttered office and his ghost-filled past. Zara Mikhailov met him in the lobby, her presence as sharp and defined as the architecture around them. In person, her confidence was even more pronounced, a force of nature in a tailored business suit. She led him to a conference room where one entire wall was a transparent screen, currently displaying a slowly rotating, high-resolution image of the derelict capsule against the stark backdrop of space. We've been running non-stop analyses since we acquired the telemetry, Zara said, gesturing to the screen. A flood of data appeared beside the image tables of figures, spectral graphs, orbital mechanics. First, it is not a satellite. The ablative heat shield has a ceramic composite, specifically asbestos phenolic resin. That was a signature of the early Vostok and Vokshod programs. It was heavy, inefficient, but it worked. Dmitri stepped closer to the screen, his academic skepticism a shield that was beginning to feel paper-thin. He studied the numbers, his old training kicking in. The decay rate? He asked, his voice raspy. That's the problem, Zara confirmed, anticipating his question. She brought up a new chart, a spaghetti tangle of lines representing known Soviet launch trajectories from 1957 to 1965. Its current orbital path is anomalous. It doesn't match the inclination or apogee of any documented launch, successful or failed. According to the public record, this object should not be where it is. It should not exist at all. He stared at the data, at the cold, hard proof of an impossibility. For decades, he had lived with a haunting sound. Now, here was the object that had produced it, rendered in pixels and light, its existence confirmed by spectrographs and Doppler shifts. The sensation was unnerving, a dizzying blend of terror and vindication. The young, frightened analyst inside him was being told by the technology of the future that he had not been crazy. He had been a witness. That night, Dmitri descended into his basement. The sterile, light-filled modernity of Aurium-X felt a world away. This was his true office, his secret archive, where his university space was a curated exhibit of a rational mind. The basement was the raw, chaotic subconscious. Shelves overflowed with dusty electronics, Cold War-era manuals, and notebooks filled with calculations that had no official purpose. It was the lair of an obsessive, a man who had never truly left his listening post. With a turn of a key that felt momentous, he unlocked a heavy, army green metal footlocker. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in foam that was beginning to yellow and crumble, were dozens of reel-to-reel tapes. Each was meticulously labeled in his own tight Cyrillic script. These were his unsanctioned logs, the original recordings and copies he had made in secret, the data he refused to surrender when they had ordered him to forget. These were the whispers, the anomalies, the ghosts he was supposed to have dismissed as atmospheric noise. His fingers, trembling slightly, ghosted over the labels before landing on one in particular. Zarya Anomaly, 1961. The name Zarya, meaning dawn, had been the codename for a series of early, unmanned tests. But this recording was different. It was the clearest, the longest, the one that had burrowed deepest into his soul. He lifted the tape from its cradle. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with the gravity of 50 years of silence. This was not science. This was a relic. And he was about to submit it to an oracle. He worked for hours, a bridge between two eras. On one side of his workbench sat the Jupiter 202, a relic of analog mechanics and magnetic fields. On the other, a sleek, powerful laptop running the analysis software Zara had provided. He fed the audio from his 1961 recording into the computer, watching as the sounds that had lived only in his head and in the privacy of his headphones were translated into the cool, objective language of a digital waveform. The distorted, rhythmic static filled the small room, a sound that made the hairs on his arms stand up. On the screen, the waveform was a chaotic jumble, an erratic signature of noise. This was what his superiors had dismissed. This was the data that was officially meaningless. Then, with a few keystrokes, he imported the file Zara had sent him, the continuous low-level radio emissions still being faintly transmitted by the derelict capsule, captured by the immense, sensitive ears of Aurium-X's deep space network. He instructed the software to overlay the two signals. The screen flickered as the program went to work, comparing, contrasting, searching for correlation. And then it appeared. A new line, colored a vibrant green, traced itself directly over the chaotic spikes of his 1961 recording. It was a perfect match. The faint, rhythmic pulse from the capsule tumbling through space in the year 2025 was a precise, time-decayed echo of the ghost he had recorded half a century ago. The pattern was identical. The interval between the strained breaths was the same. Dmitri stared, his own breath catching in his throat. He felt a profound tremor run through him, a seismic shifting of his entire world. It was the same object. The sound had a source. The ghost had a fingerprint. The superstition of his memory was now a verifiable, empirical fact. He leaned back in his chair, utterly shaken. A man who had just seen undeniable proof that his entire life had been predicated on a lie. The next day, he arranged to meet Zara at a small coffee shop downtown, a neutral space between her world and his. He needed to show her the overlay, to plan their next move in person. He arrived early, clutching a tablet computer containing the data like a holy text. As he waited, stirring a sugar cube he had no intention of using into his black coffee, the chair opposite him was pulled out. Dmitri looked up, expecting to see Zara. Instead, his blood ran cold. The man who sat down was Valery Orlov. He was the same age as Dmitri, but where Dmitri was worn and weary, Orlov was sharp and imposing, his cold grey eyes missing nothing. He wore an expensive suit with the casual authority of a man who had never had to pay for one himself. He was Dmitri's former superior from the GRU, a man who had personified the chilling certainty of the Soviet state. "Dmitri," Orlov said, his voice a calm, measured tone that hadn't changed in 30 years. He smiled, but it was a reptile-esque smile, all teeth and no warmth. "It has been a long time. I see the academic life suits you." "Valery," Dmitri managed, his throat suddenly dry. "I was in the neighborhood," Orlov continued smoothly, ignoring Dmitri's shock. "I read that interesting news story. A piece of old space junk has the world so excited. It is amazing what people will believe, isn't it?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. "It reminds me of the old days. Those ghost signals you were so fond of chasing. We had a name for it, didn't we?" ionospheric reflection. He let the words hang in the air. A powerful phenomenon, and a very useful one. Orlov looked past Dmitri, out the window, as if admiring the view. You know, Dmitri, some sleeping dogs are best left to lie. History has enough ghosts without us inventing new ones. He stood up, placing a few bills on the table for Dmitri's coffee. The threat was never spoken, but it was as clear and as cold as the Siberian winter. It was in the use of that phrase, ionospheric reflection. It was a direct warning. It was a command. Orlov gave a final thin smile. It was good to see you looking so well, old friend. And then he was gone. Dmitri sat frozen, his hand trembling so hard the coffee cup rattled in its saucer. The scientific mystery had just ended. The conspiracy had just begun. The ghost of Valery Orlov's threat lingered in the air long after he was gone. Dmitri left the coffee shop, the tablet computer feeling less like a book of revelations and more like a death warrant. He walked directly to Zara's apartment, a sleek, minimalist space high above the city. The moment she saw his face, she knew something had gone terribly wrong. He didn't speak at first, simply setting the tablet on her glass coffee table and bringing up the image of the two overlaid waveforms. The perfect, damning correlation. He found me, Dmitri said, his voice low and strained. Orlov, my former superior, he knows. He recounted the conversation, the veiled words that carried the weight of a guillotine. The phrase, ionospheric reflection, was not a suggestion. It was an order, a reminder of the official reality he was expected to uphold. Zara listened, her expression hardening from concern to steely resolve. They're not going to just intimidate us, Dmitri, she said, pacing the length of her floor-to-ceiling window. They'll discredit us. They'll bury us in legal challenges. They'll erase the capsule from the sky if they have to. They operate in the dark. The only thing they fear is sunlight. She stopped pacing and turned to him, her eyes bright with a dangerous idea. We can't win this fight in the shadows. We have to make it public. We have to give the story to someone they can't silence. Working together, they drafted an email. It was anonymous, sent from an encrypted server. It was concise, containing only the most potent facts. The image of the capsule, the data proving it was a Vostok-era re-entry vehicle on an unlisted trajectory, and the crown jewel, the image of the two perfectly matched waveforms. The ghost and the machine, united as one. They addressed it to a name Dmitri knew only by reputation. A Pulitzer-winning investigative journalist, famous for taking on government cover-ups and winning. Zara's finger hovered over the send button. Once we do this, she said, her voice quiet but firm, there is no going back, for either of us. Dmitri looked at the screen, at the culmination of his life's secret obsession and her life's work. He thought of Orlov's cold smile. He nodded. Send it. She clicked the button. The email vanished into the ether. A secret, 50 years in the making, was finally out in the world. The leak worked faster than they could have imagined. The story exploded online, picked up by major news outlets within hours. For a brief, glorious morning, Dmitri felt a sense of triumph. The truth was out. But the pushback was a tidal wave. By midday, Dmitri sat in his university office, watching a live broadcast on his computer. A man named Dr. Pavel Antonov, a smarmy, telegenic astrophysicist with an impeccable state-sponsored pedigree, was systematically tearing their evidence to shreds. Antonov, clearly and thoroughly briefed by Orlov's agency, was a master of his craft. What we have here, Antonov said, a condescending smile playing on his lips, is a classic example of pseudoscience masquerading as discovery. The proponents of this theory present us with ghost whispers and coincidental waveforms, but they fail to provide a single testable hypothesis. He leaned into the camera, a picture of pure reason. Science operates on the principle of falsifiability. A claim is only scientific if it can be proven false. The claim that these are ghosts is not falsifiable. It is a story, not a science. The far more likely, and frankly, the only scientific explanation is a chance correlation of atmospheric distortion and a faulty transmitter on a piece of old space debris. He dismissed their painstaking work with a wave of his hand, turning the very language of scientific rigor into a weapon of ridicule. Just as he finished speaking, Dmitri's office phone rang. It was the university dean, his voice tight with controlled fury, demanding a meeting to discuss the grave reputational damage Dmitri was inflicting upon the institution. The establishment gatekeeper's power was absolute. They didn't just control the past, they controlled the very definition of truth in the present. Despondent, Dmitri retreated to the one place left to him, the cluttered sanctuary of his basement. He had been so sure. The waveform data was proof, but Antonov had expertly reframed it as coincidence, as noise. Dmitri had been made to look like a fool, a conspiracy theorist chasing ghosts in the static. He felt himself failing, the weight of 50 years of silence crashing down on him. He sat before his equipment, staring at the screen displaying the 1961 recording. It was just noise. Orlov was right. Antonov was right. It was just an echo in a dead sky. But as he prepared to shut it down, a thought struck him. Zara's analysis software was more powerful than anything he'd ever had access to. He had used it to find the correlation, but he hadn't used it to interrogate the original signal on its own terms, to apply the most advanced filters. On a desperate whim, a final, futile gesture, he began to work. He applied filter after filter, peeling back layers of static, noise, and atmospheric distortion. He worked for hours, losing track of time, chasing a ghost he no longer believed in. And then he saw it, for less than a second on the original recording. Buried so deep in the noise it was utterly imperceptible to the human ear, was a tiny, coherent burst of data. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't breathing. It was a clean digital signal, a string of 5-digit codes. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. This was new. This was not random. He frantically searched his online archives for declassified Soviet technical manuals, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He found what he was looking for, a manual for the Vostok 1K prototype capsule. He cross-referenced the codes. They weren't random numbers. They were a perfect match for a star alignment checksum from the onboard Globus navigation instrument, a device that showed the capsule's position over the Earth. More importantly, it was a fail-safe reading, a number that had to be manually entered and confirmed by a pilot to calibrate the system. This wasn't an echo. This wasn't a faulty transmitter. This was a message. A human being, a trained cosmonaut, had typed those numbers. The ghost wasn't just whispering anymore. It was navigating. The entire nature of his quest had changed. It wasn't about if someone was in that capsule. It was about who. His mind was on fire. The star alignment data wasn't just a message. It was a position, a timestamp. He began to calculate, his old skills returning with a terrifying clarity. The specific star chart referenced by the checksum could have only been visible from a specific orbital position on a specific date. The math was complex, but the answer it gave was absolute. October 11th, 1960. October 11th, 1960. The date seared itself into his brain. He scrambled from his chair, throwing open the heavy metal footlocker that held his secret history. He rummaged past tapes and notebooks, his hands searching for a specific file. He found it at the bottom, a thin, brittle folder of documents he had stolen from the KGB archives on the day he retired. It was his insurance policy, his secret truth. The file was labeled Baikonur Launchpad Incidents, 1959-1962. He flipped through the pages, his breath catching in his throat. And there it was, the entry for October 11th, 1960. The mission was codenamed Zarya 1. The official report was brief, clinical, and final. Catastrophic failure on launchpad. Vehicle destroyed. No casualties. Dmitri stared at the words, then back at his calculations. A catastrophic failure on the launch pad. But the star chart, the checksum from the pilot's own hand, proved the capsule had not only launched, but had successfully reached orbit. The official report was a fabrication. The entire incident was a lie. He was holding the proof. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a cover-up. A specific lie tied to a specific mission on a specific date. He had the smoking gun, and he knew with chilling certainty that the people who had written that lie would do anything to keep it from ever seeing the light of day. The discovery of the Zarya 1 file was not a triumph. It was the pulling of a pin from a grenade. The knowledge was too heavy, too dangerous to keep to himself. That night, from the relative safety of his basement, Dmitri initiated a video call with Zara. He held the brittle, yellow document up to the camera, the black Cyrillic letters stark and damning. "They didn't just lie, Zara," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "They fabricated an entire event, a catastrophic failure that never happened. This capsule, this pilot, they were erased." Zara's face on the screen was pale, her eyes wide with the enormity of his discovery. "Dmitri, this is..." She never finished the sentence. From upstairs came a sudden, violent eruption of barking. It was Boris, his old terrier, a dog that never made a sound without reason. At the same instant, the lights in the basement flickered and died, plunging him into near-total darkness, the only illumination coming from the ghostly glow of the laptop screen. A heartbeat later, he heard it. The unmistakable, sickening sound of a window shattering on the ground floor. "They're here," he hissed, his mind flashing back to Orlov's cold smile. This was the consequence. The narrative manipulation had failed, and now the brutes had been sent. A black sedan he hadn't noticed, parked down the street. It all clicked into place. "Zara, get off this channel. Erase the logs. Run," he commanded, his old training surging through the academic fog. He disconnected the call, his hands moving with instinctual speed. He grabbed two things: the Zarya 1 file, tucking it into his shirt, and the single critical reel-to-reel tape, the Zarya anomaly recording. He shoved it into the deep pocket of his coat. He could hear heavy footsteps splintering the floorboards above him. He didn't hesitate. He wrenched open the small basement window that led to the back garden, scrambling out into the cold night air, just as the basement door at the top of the stairs crashed open. He fled into the darkness, a 71-year-old fugitive with the truth clutched to his chest. The world Dmitri had known for 40 years, the world of tweed jackets, university libraries, and intellectual debate, had vanished. He was now adrift in a different city, a shadow city that operated on paranoia and mistrust. Through a desperate, coded message to the journalist Zara had contacted, he was given an address. It led him to a cramped apartment above a pawn shop, the air thick with the smell of aging paper and solder fumes. The man who opened the door was wiry and suspicious, with eyes that darted constantly to the street below. His name was Anton, and Dmitri recognized the type instantly. He was a dissident, a man who had spent his life fighting the very state Dmitri had once served. The apartment was a chaotic fortress, filled with stacks of anti-government literature, shortwave radios, and signal jamming equipment. It was a world built on the assumption that the walls had ears, and it was now Dmitri's only refuge. He was forced to place his life and his secret into the hands of a man he once would have surveilled, a man whose existence was a testament to the state's cruelty. As he looked out the grimy window at the city below, a city that no longer felt like his own, he understood the totality of his transformation. He was no longer Professor Volkov, a respected member of the establishment. He was an outsider, a ghost, a man without a country, allied with his former enemies. He had to rely on a network bound not by rules and regulations, but by faith in a cause and a shared opposition to a common foe, the very unscientific human elements he had spent his life dismissing. That night, there was a quiet knock on the door. It was Zara, her face obscured by a scarf and a heavy coat, the very picture of a conspirator. She looked exhausted, her usual vibrant energy dimmed by fear. "They're crippling us," she said, her voice low and urgent. "A surprise government audit. They've frozen our accounts, citing national security concerns. My board is convening an emergency meeting tomorrow. They're going to vote to cease all operations related to the orbital debris. They're terrified." They were being boxed in, systematically and efficiently. Dmitri looked at her, the reality of their situation settling in like a shroud. "Then proving the capsule's existence is no longer enough," he said. "Even if we leak the Zarya 1 file, Orlov's agency will just say it's a forgery. They'll recover the capsule in secret or simply destroy it, erase the evidence for good." A new terrifying objective began to form. They couldn't just be historians, revealing a past crime. They had to become agents, intervening in the present. "We need the flight recorder," Zara said, her voice barely a whisper, as if saying it too loud would make it impossible. "The black box. We need to retrieve it ourselves, or force a public recovery that they can't control." The goal had shifted from a passive pursuit of truth to an active, high-risk intelligence operation. It would require a synthesis of his old-world spycraft and her new-world technology, a desperate fusion of two generations against a monolithic enemy. Anton, the dissident, had access to technology that was illegal for civilians, equipment designed to listen to the state's secret conversations. For the next 2 days, Dmitri worked tirelessly, using Anton's setup to scan encrypted government satellite frequencies. It was a needle in a haystack of digital noise, but Dmitri knew what to listen for. He was searching for a ghost of his own making, and then he found it. A digital fist, as they used to call it, the unique, cryptographic signature of his old department's encryption protocols. He had helped design the system in the 1980s. It was archaic, but still in use. And because he had built it, he knew its flaws. He worked for hours, exploiting a backdoor he himself had coded into the system 4 decades ago. Finally, a fragment of a message unscrambled on his screen. It was a command protocol, a string of numbers and trajectory vectors being sent from a ground station to a Russian military satellite. The satellite was designated Cosmos 2499, officially a debris clearer. The command was a trajectory burn, an orbital adjustment. He ran the numbers, his blood turning to ice as he saw the result. The new trajectory would put the debris clearer on a direct collision course with the Zarya 1 capsule. The collision was timed for precisely 72 hours from now. They weren't just going to let it fall. They were going to execute it, pushing it into a high-speed, uncontrolled atmospheric burn-up over the most remote stretch of the Pacific Ocean. Nothing would survive. No wreckage, no recorder, no truth. Their window to act was closing. The ticking clock wasn't just for the truth anymore. It was for the ghost in the machine herself. The 72-hour countdown had bled away into a terrifying final hour. Their new command center was an abandoned warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city, cold, cavernous, and anonymous. It had been hastily converted into a mission control by a handful of Zara's most loyal engineers, a small band of rebels waging a private war against a nation-state. On a massive makeshift screen at the center of the room, 2 icons crept across a starfield. One, labeled Zarya 1, was the tumbling capsule. The other, Cosmos 2499, was the state-sanctioned assassin, closing in fast. "There's no other way," Zara said, her face illuminated by the screen's glow. "We can't outrun it. We can't hide. We have to meet it head-on." She turned to her lead engineer. "Execute." The plan was a desperate, costly gamble. Zara was sacrificing one of her own multi-million-dollar civilian communications satellites. With a few keystrokes, the engineer sent the command. On the screen, a third icon, Aurium-1, altered its course, firing its thrusters in a long, sustained burn. It was pushing its systems to their absolute limit, screaming through its designated orbit on a high-risk intercept course with the Zarya 1 capsule. It was a race a private company driven by a thirst for discovery, challenging the raw power of a state determined to bury its history. "We're closing the gap," the engineer announced, his voice tight with tension. "Intercept in 5 minutes." "They know," Dmitri said quietly, his eyes fixed on the screen. "They must know." He was right. As Aurium-1 closed in, the screen suddenly glitched. A cascade of error messages scrolled down the display. Alarms blared, a cacophony of digital screams. "We're losing the command link," Zara yelled. "They're hitting us with everything they've got." It was a massive cyber attack, a digital sledgehammer aimed at severing their control over their own satellite. Zara's engineers fought back, their fingers flying across keyboards, deploying modern countermeasures. But it was no use. The attack was too sophisticated, too powerful. The controls were unresponsive. Their satellite was now just a dead piece of metal hurtling through space. "It's Orlov's agency," Dmitri breathed, stepping closer to the main console. He peered at the lines of corrupt code scrolling past, and in the chaotic stream, he saw a ghost, a pattern, a familiar structure buried beneath the modern attack protocols. It was an archaic foundation from the 1980s, a system he had helped design. "Move," he said, gently pushing a stunned engineer aside and sitting down at a secondary keyboard. He didn't try to fight the attack head-on. He didn't counter the code. He began typing a new sequence, a string of commands that hadn't been used in 40 years. He was not fighting the monster. He was slipping through a crack in its armor he himself had left behind, exploiting a forgotten backdoor into the heart of the system. He was a ghost in their machine. "What are you doing?" Zara asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Speaking their mother tongue," Dmitri replied without looking up. For a moment, nothing happened. The alarms continued to blare. And then, one by one, the error messages vanished. A single clean command line appeared on the main screen. The controls were back online. Dmitri's code had worked. He had given them a window. "We have control," the lead engineer shouted. 30 seconds to intercept!" Zara seized the moment. "Execute final command, now!" On the screen, they watched as a robotic arm extended from the side of their Aurium-1 satellite. It reached out across the small gap of space and, with a gentle precision that belied the incredible speeds involved, latched onto the charred hull of the Zara-1 capsule. It couldn't bring it back. Its engines weren't designed for that kind of maneuver. But it could do one more thing. Zara typed the final command: "Fire." A small thruster on the robotic arm fired a short, sharp burst. The jolt was just enough to trigger the 60-year-old parachute deployment sequence on the ancient capsule. The main chute, brittle with age and radiation, shredded into cosmic dust the instant it was released. But the explosive bolts designed to blow the parachute hatch fired perfectly. That tiny explosion was all they needed. It nudged the capsule, altering its trajectory just enough. It missed the intercept. The Cosmos 2499 killer satellite shot past, its deadly purpose unfulfilled. Zara-1, its course now irrevocably changed, began a fiery but slower descent into the atmosphere. And as it fell, its emergency locator beacon, dormant for over half a century, flickered to life, screaming its position, its existence, its truth, to every listening station on the planet. They had lost the capsule, but they had won. The aftermath was a cascade of falling secrets. News helicopters swarmed over a smoking crater in the vast, remote Siberian tundra. Images flooded the internet of an international recovery team, watched by grim-faced Russian officials, hoisting a charred conical capsule from the snow. There were shots of scientists in a sterile clean room, carefully, reverently, removing a primitive flight recorder. Then came the press conference, a stone-faced Russian general, forced before the world's cameras, officially admitting the existence of Senior Lieutenant Dmitri Volkov, the pilot of the lost Zara-1 mission. And then there was the audio. The world fell silent to listen to a ghost. The tape was played on every news channel. First, the static Dmitri knew so well. Then, a woman's voice, calm and clear, filled with a profound sense of awe. She described the impossible blue of the Earth's curve. She spoke of the stars, not as distant points of light, but as a silent, welcoming neighborhood. There was a brief, soft gasp of wonder, and then a final peaceful sign-off as a single chiming telemetry alarm for her oxygen levels began to sound softly in the background. Her last moments were not of terror, but of scientific wonder. The superstition had been given a name, and her voice humanized the ghost forever. Months later, a new monument stood in Moscow's Alley of Cosmonauts, a gleaming spire of titanium and granite, and Senior Lieutenant Lyudmila Volkova's name was now enshrined alongside the legends Gagarin, Titov, Tereshkova. Dmitri stood before it, looking older, yes, but the haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep and settled peace. He placed a single red carnation at the monument's base. "Her family is grateful," a voice said beside him. It was Zara. Her company, Aurium-X, was back, stronger and more famous than ever. "We're naming our first deep space vessel the Volkova." Dmitri nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. He looked up from the carved name on the monument to the vast, open sky above. His long war was over. He had followed the evidence to its absolute limit, and it had led him to a truth that required more than just data to accept. It required a leap of faith, an acceptance of the human story behind the static. The journey was complete. The scientist had finally made peace with the ghost. What is more powerful? A scientific fact or a ghost story? In the story of Dmitri Volkov, the scientific explanation for the strange sounds from space was ionospheric reflection. It has a perfectly rational, evidence-based answer. But for Dmitri, it felt like a lie. The sound he heard on his tape, the rhythmic, strained breathing, felt too personal, too real to be dismissed as a simple atmospheric quirk. This is the fascinating tension at the heart of the story. It suggests that sometimes the most compelling truths aren't the ones that satisfy our intellect, but the ones that haunt our intuition. Dmitri's journey wasn't about abandoning science for superstition. On the contrary, he needed cutting-edge technology to ultimately prove his ghost was real. The story proposes something more subtle, that what we call superstition might sometimes be an echo of a truth we don't have the tools to measure yet. The ghost of the Lost Cosmonaut wasn't a supernatural being. She was a real person, but her story would have been silenced forever if not for one man's refusal to let go of a sound that haunted him for 50 years. It makes you wonder about the relationship between evidence and belief. So, here's my question for you. Have you ever had a gut feeling or an intuition that went against all logic and evidence, only to later find out that your feeling was right all along?